The Servant of Shadows. This story is true. It happened in the mountains of Zacatecas, Mexico, in a place where people still refuse to speak certain names after the sun goes down. I know it is true because I lived it, because I still carry the scars on my back, because even now, 23 years later, I cannot close my eyes without seeing what I saw in that darkness. I was paid to poison other people's cattle. I walked through the mountains at night alone carrying a bag of tainted corn. I thought it was just a job. I thought I could stop whenever I wanted. But there are things in this world that once started can never be stopped. And there are places that once entered will never truly let you leave. My name is Ramiro, and if you are listening to this, I pray you never make the same mistakes I did. It began when I was 23 years old. I lived in a small village nestled between dry hills and dirt roads, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone and nothing ever changes. My wife Lucia had just given birth to our first child, a boy we named Miguel after my father. He was healthy, loud, and hungry, always hungry, crying through the night while Lucia tried to feed him with whatever little nourishment her exhausted body could produce. We were poor, not the kind of poor where you skip a meal here and there, but the kind where you lie awake at night doing math in your head, counting the days until the rice runs out, until the landlord comes knocking, until everything falls apart. Our rent was 2 weeks overdue. The cabinet where we kept food had nothing but a half-empty bag of beans and some stale tortillas. And every time I looked at my son, at his tiny fingers and his trusting eyes, I felt something tighten around my chest like a fist. When you watch your child cry from hunger at 2 in the morning, and you know there is nothing in the house to give him, you will understand why I said yes to anything. I met Ernesto at the weekly market on a Thursday morning when the sun was just beginning to burn away the mountain fog. He was selling milk and cheese from his ranch, struggling to load heavy crates into his old pickup truck. I helped him without thinking, the way poor people help each other because we know what it feels like to have no one. He thanked me, looked me over with the appraising eyes of a man used to judging livestock, and asked if I needed work. That question changed everything. Ernesto was 35, dark-skinned from years under the sun, with rough hands and a serious face that could soften into unexpected warmth. He owned a ranch about 2 hours from the village up in the mountains where the air was thin and the nights were cold. He raised cattle for milk and cheese, sold them at markets across the region, and had built a decent life for himself, his wife Magdalena, and their 4 children. He offered me a job, 5 days at the ranch, 2 days home with my family. The pay was more than I had ever made. I accepted before he finished speaking. The first time I saw the ranch, I understood why people said Ernesto was lucky. The land stretched across a small valley surrounded by hills with green pastures that seemed impossibly lush compared to the dry scrubland around my village. There were dozens of cattle, a solid barn, a main house with a red tile roof, and a small wooden shack near the edge of the property where the workers slept. That shack would become my home for the next year, and my prison. The smell hit me first when I arrived. Dry manure mixed with wet grass, thick and heavy, coating the inside of my nostrils until I could taste it on my tongue. It was not unpleasant exactly, but dense, as if the air itself had weight. The old workers said you got used to it after a few days. I never did. Even now, over 2 decades later, whenever I smell that particular combination of earth and animal, my heart starts racing and my hands begin to shake. The shack had 1 room with a cot, a small table, and a single oil lamp. The walls were thin wood that did nothing to keep out the cold at night or the heat during the day. There was no electricity, no running water, no phone. The nearest neighbor was a 30-minute walk through rough terrain. The nearest town was 2 hours by truck on roads that turned to mud whenever it rained. At night, the only sounds were the wind, the crickets, and the bells. The bells. Every cow wore a small metal bell around its neck, and when they moved, the bells rang out across the valley. Ting, 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 slow and steady like a heartbeat. At first I found it peaceful, a gentle rhythm that helped me fall asleep after long days of hard labor. I would lie on my cot listening to the distant tinkling and think about Lucia and Miguel waiting for me back home. I did not know then that the sound of those bells would haunt me for the rest of my life. The work was brutal. I woke at 4 in the morning when the sky was still black and the cold bit through my clothes like teeth. I milked cows until my hands cramped. I cleaned stalls, shoveled manure, repaired fences, chopped wood. By the time the sun set, my body ached in places I did not know could ache. But I did not complain. Every peso I earned was food on my family's table, was rent paid, was one more day my son would not go hungry. Weeks passed, then months. Ernesto and I grew close. He was not just my employer anymore. He became my friend, my confidant, the older brother I never had. We ate breakfast together in the ranch house kitchen, sharing strong coffee and stories about our lives. He told me about his struggles building the ranch, about the sleepless nights worrying over sick cattle, about his dreams for his children. I told him about Lucia, about Miguel, about my hope that one day I could build a small house for my family. One afternoon, sitting under an old mesquite tree, watching the cattle graze, I asked him a question I had been thinking about for weeks. "Compadre," I said, "would you be the godfather of my son?" He turned to look at me, something unreadable flickering in his eyes. Then he nodded, slow and solemn. "It would be my honor," he said. From that day forward we were compadres, a sacred bond in our culture almost like blood. I ate dinner with his family every Sunday. Magdalena cooked her best dishes. The children called me Uncle Ramiro and followed me around the barn, asking endless questions. Sometimes we all went to the beach together, both families piled into Ernesto's truck, laughing and singing along the dusty roads. Those were good days, the best days of my life, maybe. But even then, even in those bright moments, I sometimes felt something watching me. It started small, a prickling at the back of my neck when I was alone in the fields, a shadow moving wrong in the corner of my eye. The sudden certainty that someone was standing right behind me, close enough to touch, only to turn around and find nothing but empty air. I told myself it was exhaustion. The long hours, the isolation, the strain of being away from my family. The mind plays tricks when the body is tired. Everyone knows that. But there were other things harder to explain. On my third night at the ranch, I heard footsteps outside my shack. Heavy, slow, deliberate. Like someone circling the building, testing the walls, looking for a way in. I grabbed the oil lamp and opened the door, heart pounding, expecting to find a thief or a drunk farmhand. There was no one, just the cattle sleeping in the distant pasture and the wind rustling through the grass. Probably just a cow that wandered off, I told myself. Or maybe the wind moving branches. I closed the door and tried to sleep. But deep down I knew those footsteps did not sound like a cow walking. They sounded like a person, a very large person. The next morning I found a circle of flattened grass right outside my door. Perfect, precise, as if someone had stood there all night watching. Ernesto said it was probably a stray dog lying down to rest. I nodded and agreed, even though I knew no dog leaves a mark like that. Even though I knew dogs do not stand in one place for hours without moving. I did not mention the footsteps. The strange occurrences continued over the following weeks, always small enough to dismiss, never quite enough to prove anything. The oil lamp in my shack would flicker and die at odd moments even when there was no wind. I would set things down and find them moved when I returned. Once I woke in the middle of the night, absolutely certain that someone was in the room with me, could feel their presence like a weight on my chest. But when I lit the lamp, I was alone. And always, I felt watched. It was worst at twilight, that liminal hour when the sun bleeds red across the hills and shadows stretch like grasping fingers. I would be walking back from the pasture's tools over my shoulder, and suddenly the hair on my arms would rise. I would stop, listen, scan the tree line, the hills, the gathering darkness. Nothing. But the feeling would not leave. It clung to me like a second skin, followed me into the shack, sat beside me while I ate my simple dinner, lay next to me when I tried to sleep. Someone is watching, a voice whispered in my head. Something. Nonsense, I told myself, superstition. The fears of an uneducated man from a backward village. But the mountains have their own truths, older than books, older than churches, older than the language we speak. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the things that live in the wild places, the spirits that guard certain lands, the prices paid by those who trespass where they should not go. I had laughed at those stories as a child. I was not laughing anymore. It was during my 4th month at the ranch that everything began to change. The signs were subtle at first. Ernesto grew quieter, more withdrawn. He spent long hours alone in the barn, going over accounts, muttering numbers under his breath. The easy warmth between us cooled. He snapped at Magdalena over small things. The children learned to stay out of his way. Business troubles, I thought. Every farmer has them. Then one evening, while we were repairing a fence in the western pasture, he told me the truth. "They are destroying me," he said, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "Aurelio and the others. They are selling cheaper, taking my customers, bleeding me dry." He slammed his hammer against a post hard enough to split the wood. "If this continues, I will lose everything." I tried to comfort him, to tell him things would improve. He just shook his head, his eyes distant and dark. A week later, 2 of our healthiest cows fell sick. They would not eat. Their eyes went glassy and dull. They breathed in short, labored gasps, as if something was crushing their lungs from inside. By the next morning, one was dead. The other followed before sunset. Ernesto stood over their bodies for a long time, not speaking, not moving. "This is not natural," he finally said. "Someone did this to us." I wanted to argue. Cattle get sick sometimes. It happens. But the look in his eyes stopped me cold. It was not grief I saw there, or even anger. It was certainty. That night the full moon rose over the mountains, fat and yellow and somehow wrong, like an eye opening in the sky. October, the locals called it, the month of the dead. The air felt electric, charged with something I could not name. I was lying on my cot, drifting toward an uneasy sleep, when someone knocked on my door. I looked at the cheap watch on my wrist. 1:47 in the morning. I opened the door to find Ernesto standing there, his face half lit by an oil lamp, shadows pooling in the hollows of his cheeks. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. He looked like a man who had made a decision he could not take back. "Get dressed," he said. "We are going somewhere." I should have asked where. I should have asked why. I should have told him no, that it was the middle of the night, that whatever it was could wait until morning. But I remembered my empty cabinet back home. I remembered Miguel crying from hunger. I remembered all the money Ernesto had given me, all the meals, all the kindness when no one else would help. So I got dressed, and I followed him into the darkness. He drove without speaking, the truck bouncing over dirt roads that wound higher into the mountains. The headlights cut weak tunnels through the black, illuminating nothing but dust and rocks, and the occasional flash of animal eyes in the underbrush. I gripped the dashboard as we climbed, my stomach churning with a fear I could not explain. Finally, after nearly an hour, he pulled over and killed the engine. "We walk from here," he said. He handed me a burlap sack. It was heavy, filled with something that felt like grain. But under the grain I could smell something else, something chemical, something wrong. "What is this?" I asked, though I already knew. Ernesto looked at me, his eyes flat and hard. "Justice," he said. And then he told me what we were going to do. We were going to sneak onto Aurelio's ranch. We were going to feed this tainted corn to his cattle. We were going to destroy his livelihood the way he was destroying ours. I stood there in the darkness, the bag in my hands, and felt something inside me crack. This is wrong, I thought. This is evil. But then I thought about my family, about the money, about what Ernesto would think if I refused, if I turned my back on my compadre when he needed me most. There are moments in life when you stand at a crossroads, when you can still choose the right path. I stood at that crossroads on a moonlit night in the mountains of Zacatecas, and I chose wrong. We did what we came to do. We snuck onto Aurelio's land, scattered the poisoned corn among his sleeping cattle, and fled before anyone could see us. By the time we returned to Ernesto's ranch, the sky was beginning to lighten in the east. I did not sleep that day, or the next. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those cattle, peaceful and trusting, eating the poison I had given them. But that was just the beginning. Because what I did not know then, what I could not have known, was that not all land is the same. Not all ranches are equal. Some places in this world are protected by forces older and darker than anything we can understand. And one of those places belonged to a man named Don Jacinto. His ranch lay deeper in the mountains in a valley that people whispered about but never visited. They said his cattle were always healthy, his milk always sweet, his crops always abundant. They said he had made a deal with something in those hills. They said he was protected. I did not believe the stories, not then. But Ernesto did not care about stories. He only cared about winning. And 1 month after our first night mission, he called me to the barn and told me my next target. Don Jacinto's ranch, he said. You will go alone this time. I felt my blood turn to ice. Compadre, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. You know what they say about that place. About him. Ernesto laughed, but there was no humor in it. Old wives' tales, he said. Superstitions. You are not a child, Ramiro. You do not believe in monsters. He was right. I did not believe in monsters. Not then. That night, as I drove alone toward the mountains, I told myself there was nothing to fear. That the stories were just stories. That I would do the job and come home and everything would be fine. The moon hung heavy in the sky, and somewhere in the darkness ahead something was waiting. Something that had been waiting for a very long time. The road to Don Jacinto's ranch was not on any map. Ernesto had drawn it for me on a scrap of paper, a rough sketch of turns and landmarks that seemed to dissolve into meaninglessness once I passed the last known village. The truck's headlights carved a narrow path through absolute darkness, and on either side the mountains rose like black walls, blocking out even the stars. I drove for nearly 2 hours, the engine straining against the steep inclines, the tires slipping on loose gravel. The further I went, the more the world seemed to change around me. The air grew colder, heavier, pressing against the windows like something trying to get in. The sounds of the night, the crickets and owls and rustling leaves gradually fell silent until there was nothing but the rumble of the engine and my own ragged breathing. Then I saw it. The valley opened up before me without warning, a sudden expanse of land surrounded by hills on all sides. Even in the darkness I could tell this place was different. The grass here was impossibly green, almost luminescent under the pale moonlight. Dozens of cattle lay scattered across the pastures, motionless shapes that could have been boulders, if not for the occasional glint of their eyes. I pulled the truck off the road and killed the engine. The silence that followed was absolute. No wind, no insects, no animal sounds of any kind. Just a vast, empty quiet that pressed against my eardrums like deep water. Something is wrong here, I thought. Something is very wrong. But I'd come too far to turn back. I had made a promise to Ernesto, and somewhere in the back of my mind I could still hear my son crying from hunger, could still see the empty cabinet in our tiny kitchen, could still feel the weight of all the debts I needed to pay. I grabbed the burlap sack and stepped out of the truck. The cold hit me immediately, sharp and biting, far colder than it should have been for October. My breath came out in white plumes that hung in the air longer than natural, as if the darkness itself was holding on to them. I pulled my jacket tighter and began walking toward the pastures. The cattle did not react to my presence. They lay completely still, eyes open but unseeing, like animals in a trance. I had worked with livestock my entire life, and I had never seen anything like this. Cows are nervous creatures. They startle at shadows, at sudden movements, at unfamiliar scents. These cows did not even blink as I walked among them. I opened the sack and began scattering the poisoned corn. My hands were shaking so badly that half of it missed the ground and fell on my boots. I moved quickly, mechanically, trying not to think about what I was doing, trying not to look at the peaceful faces of the animals I was condemning to death. I had emptied about half the sack when I heard it. A bell. Ting. Just once. Clear and sharp, cutting through the silence like a knife. I froze, my hand still buried in the sack. The sound had come from behind me, close, no more than 20 meters away. But when I turned to look, there was nothing. Just more cattle, more grass, more darkness. Probably one of the cows moving, I told myself. Their bells ring when they shift position. But none of these cows were wearing bells. I had noticed that when I arrived. Their necks were bare. I went back to work faster now, wanting nothing more than to finish and leave this place. The corn scattered across the ground in handfuls, pale kernels that almost seemed to glow against the dark earth. Then the bell rang again. Ting. Closer this time. Much closer. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight in my hand swept across the pasture, its beam cutting through the darkness in a wide arc. Nothing. The cattle remained motionless. The grass did not stir. But somewhere just beyond the reach of my light, I could feel something watching me, something patient, something that found my fear amusing. I emptied the rest of the sack in a matter of seconds, not caring any more where the corn fell, not caring about anything except getting away. I stuffed the empty burlap into my jacket and started walking back toward the truck, forcing myself not to run, not to show fear. The bell followed me. Ting, 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 steady and rhythmic, matching my footsteps exactly. When I walked faster, the ringing sped up. When I slowed down, it slowed with me, always behind, always just out of sight. I broke into a run. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly as I sprinted across the pasture, illuminating random fragments of the world around me. Grass, rocks, the distant shape of my truck, and between them, in the spaces where the light did not reach, I caught glimpses of movement. Something large, something dark, something that moved in ways that did not match any animal I knew. I was halfway to the truck when the flashlight died, not flickered, not dimmed. Died completely, as if someone had reached inside and crushed the bulb. I stood in absolute darkness, chest-heaving, sweat freezing on my skin. The bell had stopped. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own blood pulsing through my veins. Then I heard breathing. Not my own. Something else. Heavy and slow, like the breath of a large animal at rest. It came from directly behind me, so close that I could feel the warmth of it on the back of my neck. I did not turn around. I do not know how I found the strength not to turn around, but some instinct, some ancient survival mechanism buried deep in my brain told me that if I looked, I would see something that would break my mind. So I stood there trembling, staring into the darkness ahead while something breathed on my neck and waited. Seconds passed. Maybe minutes. Time lost all meaning in that infinite blackness. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the presence withdrew. The breathing faded. The air grew fractionally warmer, and in the distance I heard a sound that might have been laughter, dry and hollow, like wind through dead branches. I ran. I ran without seeing, without thinking, guided only by instinct and terror. Branches whipped my face. Rocks turned under my feet. I fell twice hard, scraping my palms and knees raw, but I did not stop. I could not stop. Behind me the laughter grew louder, closer, as if whatever made it was enjoying the chase. When I finally reached the truck, I nearly collapsed against the door. My hands were shaking so violently that it took 4 tries to get the key in the ignition. The engine coughed, sputtered, did not start. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." I turned the key again. Nothing. Again. Nothing. In the rearview mirror I saw a shape emerge from the darkness. Tall, impossibly tall, with 2 points of light, where eyes should be glowing like embers in a dying fire. "Please," I begged to God, to the truck, to anything that might listen, "please start." The shape took a step closer, then another. Each footfall made no sound, as if it was not truly touching the ground. I turned the key one more time. The engine roared to life. I slammed my foot on the accelerator and the truck lurched forward, tires spraying gravel. I did not look back. I did not want to see how close it had gotten. I just drove as fast as the old truck would carry me back down the winding mountain road. But as I reached the first bend, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time. The tall shape stood in the middle of the road watching me go, and beside it, massive and black as a moonless night, was a bull. A bull with eyes that burned like coals in a forge. The shape raised one hand slowly, almost casually. Not a wave goodbye, a promise. I did not stop driving until I reached Ernesto's ranch, and even then I sat in the truck for nearly an hour, unable to make my legs work, unable to stop shaking. Something had marked me that night. I could feel it like a brand burned into my soul, and I knew with a certainty that went beyond logic or reason that it was not finished with me. The days that followed were the worst of my life. I told Ernesto what I'd seen, or at least part of it. The bells, the breathing, the figure in the darkness. He listened without expression, then told me about the rumors surrounding Don Jacinto. People said the old man had made a deal with something in those mountains, something ancient and powerful that protected his land and his livestock. They said anyone who tried to harm what was his would pay a terrible price. I had dismissed those stories as superstition before. I would never dismiss them again, but Ernesto did not seem concerned. He was more interested in the results of our mission. Had I scattered all the corn? Had any of the cattle eaten it? Would Don Jacinto's prize animals sicken and die like Aurelio's had? 3 days later, we got our answer. Word came from the village that something strange had happened at Don Jacinto's ranch. People were talking about it in hushed voices, crossing themselves when they spoke. The morning after my visit, the old man's workers had gone to check on the cattle and found something impossible. The poisoned corn was gone, not eaten, not scattered by wind or animals, simply gone as if it had never been there. The ground where I had scattered it was bare and clean, with no trace of the pale kernels I had thrown, and the cattle themselves were perfectly healthy. Not a single one showed any sign of illness. "It did not work," Ernesto said when I told him, his voice flat with disbelief. "How could it not work? You said you scattered all of it." "I did," I replied. But something took it. Something. The word hung in the air between us, heavy with implications neither of us wanted to examine. But that was not the worst part. The worst part came 2 days later when our own cattle started dying. It began with Reina Ernesto's prized milking cow, the one he had raised from a calf and loved like a member of his family. I found her lying in the pasture one morning, unable to stand, her eyes glassy and her breathing labored. By noon she was dead. Then 2 more fell sick, then 3, then 5. The veterinarian from the city came and examined them, took samples, ran tests. He could not explain what was happening. It was not any disease he recognized. It was not poison, at least not any poison he could identify. The animals were simply dying one by one, as if something was draining the life out of them. 6 cattle in total. When I realized that number, my blood turned to ice. 6. The exact number of cattle I had tried to poison at Don Jacinto's ranch. I told Ernesto. He went pale, then angry, then silent. He did not want to believe it. Neither did I. But the coincidence was too precise to ignore. Whatever I had disturbed in those mountains was not just protecting Don Jacinto's land. It was taking revenge. The strange events did not stop at the cattle. In the weeks that followed, things began happening that I could not explain, that I did not even want to try to explain. Small things at first, easy to dismiss as coincidence or imagination. Then bigger things, things that made me question my sanity. The flashlight I always carried started malfunctioning. Not running out of batteries, I'd change those constantly, but simply refusing to work when I needed it most. It would shine fine during the day when there was plenty of light anyway, but the moment I stepped into darkness, the moment I truly needed to see it, would flicker and die. At first I thought it was a loose connection, a worn wire, something mechanical. I took it apart and put it back together. I bought a new flashlight, then another. They all did the same thing. It only fails when I'm alone. I realized one night standing in the pitch-black barn with a dead flashlight in my trembling hand. It only fails when something does not want me to see. The photograph of Lucia and Miguel that I kept on my nightstand began moving on its own. Every night I would set it facing outward so I could see their faces before I slept. Every morning I would wake to find it turned toward the wall. The first time it happened, I assumed I had knocked it over in my sleep. The second time I thought perhaps there was a draft. By the fifth time, I stopped making excuses. Someone is in this room with me at night, I thought. Something. It wants me to know it can touch my family whenever it chooses. But the worst was what I found on my bedside table one morning. A circle of dried grass woven together with meticulous precision with a small black stone placed exactly in the center. I had not brought it in. The door had been locked all night. There was no way anyone could have entered without my knowing. But I recognized the stone. It was from Don Jacinto's ranch. I had kicked it when I was running away. That night had felt it strike my boot and spin off into the darkness. Now here it was, hundreds of kilometers from where it should be sitting on my table like a message. I know where you are. I know where you sleep, and I can reach you whenever I want. I took the stone and threw it as far as I could into the wood behind the ranch. The next morning it was back on my table. I threw it again. It came back again. I buried it in the ground. I dropped it in the river. I smashed it with a hammer. Every single time it returned, always in the same spot, always perfectly clean, always waiting for me when I woke. Finally, I stopped trying to get rid of it. I put it in a box, locked the box, and tried to pretend it did not exist, but I could feel it there always. A cold spot in the corner of my room, a reminder that I was being watched. The entity that had marked me was growing bolder. Before I had only sensed its presence in the darkness, only felt its eyes on me when I was alone in the fields or the barn. Now it was coming closer, testing boundaries, seeing how far it could push before I broke. One night I was lying in bed when I heard the door of my shack creak open. I had locked it. I always locked it. But I heard the latch click, heard the hinges groan, heard slow footsteps cross the wooden floor toward my cot. I could not move. It was not that I chose not to move. I physically could not. My body was frozen, paralyzed by a fear so absolute that it transcended thought. I lay there, eyes wide open in the darkness, listening to the footsteps come closer and closer. They stopped right beside my bed. I felt breath on my face. Cold breath carrying the smell of burned wood and something else, something organic and rotting so thick that it coated my tongue and made me gag. Then a voice spoke. It was not a human voice. It was deeper, older, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a well. And it spoke directly into my ear, so close that I could feel the movement of air with each syllable. I know what you did. I know what you are. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. You thought you could harm what is mine and escape it continued. You thought there would be no consequences. Something touched my chest. A hand, or what felt like a hand, cold as river ice and heavy as a boulder. It pressed down slowly, increasing the pressure until I could barely breathe. Your compadre is the one I want, the voice said. He is the source of the poison, but you are his tool. You did his bidding, and so you too must pay. The pressure on my chest increased. Dark spots swam at the edges of my vision. I give you one warning, the voice said. Leave him. Never return to my land. Never harm what is mine again. Do this, and I will let you live out your days in peace. The pressure released slightly. I gasped for air, my lungs burning. But know this, the voice added, and now it sounded almost satisfied. The debt does not disappear, it is merely postponed. If not you, then your children. If not your children, then their children. Your bloodline is marked now, and one day I will come to collect. The presence withdrew, the footsteps retreated, the door opened and closed. I lay there until dawn, unable to move, unable to think, unable to do anything but stare at the ceiling and feel the weight of damnation pressing down on my soul. When the sun finally rose, I examined my chest. There, exactly where the hand had pressed, was a mark, faint but unmistakable. A circle of bruised flesh with something in the center that might have been a symbol or might have been a wound. It faded after a few days, but I could still feel it years later. I can still feel it now as I tell you this story. A cold spot above my heart where something inhuman left its signature. I saw it 3 times after that night. The first time was at the edge of the forest, maybe 200 meters away. It was dusk, and I was walking back from the pastures when I noticed a shape standing among the trees, tall, far taller than any man, wearing what looked like a wide-brimmed hat that concealed its face in shadow. It did not move. It just stood there watching as I hurried past with my heart in my throat. The second time was closer. I was at the river washing clothes when I looked up and saw it standing on the opposite bank, 50 meters, maybe less. Now I could see more details. The shape of its body impossibly thin, like a scarecrow made of darkness. The way it held itself perfectly still with a patience that was not human. And below the brim of the hat where a face should have been 2 points of faint red light that might have been eyes. It raised one hand and made a gesture that might have been a greeting or might have been a threat. I ran. The third time was the closest of all. I was checking the fence line near the creek alone as always when I smelled it. That smell of burning and decay so strong that my eyes watered. I turned around slowly, already knowing what I would see. It stood 10 meters away, close enough that I could hear its breathing. The figure was enormous, over 2 meters tall, wrapped in shadow that seemed to cling to it like a living thing. The hat cast its face in complete darkness, but I could see the lower half now, and what I saw made my stomach turn. The skin was wrong, textured like bark that had been charred by fire, cracked and weeping, something that was not quite blood. And the mouth, God, the mouth. It stretched across the lower face in a way that should have been impossible, pulled back to reveal teeth that gleamed like polished bone. The smell was worse up close, like a slaughterhouse after a fire, like bodies left too long in the sun, like something that had crawled out of a place where nothing should live. I wanted to run, but my legs would not obey. I wanted to scream, but my voice had abandoned me. I could only stand there trembling like a child as the thing studied me with what might have been curiosity or might have been hunger. It did not speak this time. It did not need to. Everything it wanted to say was in that terrible face, in those burning eyes, in the promise of what would happen if I ever crossed it again. Then it turned and walked away, dissolving into the shadows between the trees, as if it had never been there at all. But where it had stood, the grass was black and dead in a perfect circle, as if something had burned it from below. I did not sleep for 3 days after that. The entity was not the only thing that was changing. Ernesto grew worse by the day. The loss of cattle, the failing business, the whispered rumors in the village, all of it was eating him alive from the inside. He stopped sleeping. He stopped eating. He would stand at the edge of the pastures for hours, staring at nothing, muttering to himself in words I could not quite hear. The children avoided him. Magdalena walked on eggshells, speaking in whispers, flinching whenever he raised his voice. Even the dogs seemed afraid, slinking away when he approached, rather than greeting him with their usual enthusiasm. One night I heard screaming from the main house. I ran toward the sound and found Ernesto in the courtyard, dragging his youngest son by the arm. Tonito was crying, struggling to keep up on his short legs, while his father shouted at him to stand up straight, to stop being weak, to stop embarrassing him. The boy had been sick for days, burning with fever, barely able to eat, and Ernesto was forcing him to walk laps around the courtyard in the middle of the night because sick children are useless children. Magdalena tried to intervene. He shoved her away so hard that she fell. I stepped forward, my hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Compadre," I said, "this is not right. The boy is ill. He needs rest." Ernesto turned to look at me, and I saw something in his eyes that made me take a step back. It was not anger, or not just anger. It was something darker, something that had taken root in him and was growing. "Do not tell me how to raise my children," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do not tell me what is right and wrong. You work for me. You do what I say. Nothing more." He released Tonito, who crumpled to the ground, sobbing, and stalked back into the house. Magdalena gathered the boy in her arms, weeping silently, and carried him inside. I stood alone in the courtyard looking up at the stars and wondered how everything had gone so wrong. The man I had called compadre, the man who had saved my family, the man whose children called me uncle, was disappearing. In his place was something cold and cruel, something that the darkness had touched and twisted, and I was beginning to realize that if I stayed here much longer, the same thing would happen to me. But I could not leave, not yet, because Ernesto had one more mission for me, one final task that he swore would fix everything, would destroy Don Jacinto once and for all, would restore his business and his fortune and his pride. He wanted me to go back. When he told me, I felt the world tilt beneath my feet. Go back to that place after everything I had seen, after everything that had been done to me. It was madness. It was a death sentence. I told him no. The argument that followed was the worst we had ever had. He called me a coward, a traitor, an ungrateful dog who had forgotten everything he had done for me. He reminded me of every peso he had paid me, every meal he had given me, every kindness he had shown my family. He said that without him my son would have starved, that without him I would be nothing. And the worst part was that he was right. I owed him everything, my job, my family's survival, my son's godfather. How could I refuse him now when he needed me most? So I said yes. I said yes, and I sealed my fate. That night, as I prepared to leave for Don Jacinto's ranch one final time, I looked at the photograph of Lucia and Miguel on my nightstand. It was facing the wall again, turned by invisible hands while I packed my bag. I picked it up and studied my son's face. He was just a baby in the picture, barely a few months old, with fat cheeks and curious eyes. He did not know that his father was about to do something terrible. He did not know that his bloodline had been cursed by something older than memory. I pressed my lips to the glass. "I am sorry," I whispered. "I am so sorry." Then I put the photograph down, grabbed my bag, and walked out into the darkness. The night was cold. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, and somewhere in the mountains ahead, something was waiting for me, something that had been waiting since before I was born. The drive felt longer this time, as if the road itself was stretching, reluctant to deliver me to my destination. The headlights of the old truck barely cut through the darkness, and the engine groaned with every incline, protesting against the steep mountain paths. I gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white, my eyes fixed on the narrow strip of dirt road that wound upward into the black. Ernesto had given me twice as much poison this time, enough to kill every animal on Don Jacinto's ranch, he said, enough to destroy the old man completely. The burlap sack sat on the passenger seat beside me, heavy and accusatory, filled with tainted corn that smelled faintly of chemicals beneath the earthy grain scent. I did not want to do this. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to drive back to the village, to take Lucia and Miguel and run as far as we could. But where would we go? We had no money, no family elsewhere, no prospects. And Ernesto knew where we lived. He knew everything about us. Some prisons have no bars, I thought, as the truck climbed higher. Some chains are made of gratitude and debt and fear. The temperature dropped as I ascended, the air growing thin and sharp. Frost began to form on the windshield, and I had to keep wiping it away with my sleeve just to see the road. The heater in the old truck had stopped working months ago, and my breath came out in thick white clouds that fogged the glass almost as fast as I could clear it. Then, without warning, the engine died. Not sputtered, not coughed, simply stopped as if an invisible hand had reached under the hood and torn out its heart. I coasted to a stop on a narrow ledge overlooking the valley below. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the tick-tick-tick of the cooling engine. I turned the key. Nothing. Again. Nothing. The dashboard lights flickered once and went dark. I sat there in the freezing cab, my heart pounding, my mind racing through possibilities, bad timing, mechanical failure, coincidence. But I knew better. I knew exactly what had stopped the truck. It did not want me to drive any further. It wanted me to walk, to feel every step of my return to its domain. I grabbed the burlap sack and the flashlight that I already knew would fail when I needed it most, and stepped out into the night. The cold hit me like a physical blow, stealing the breath from my lungs. The stars were hidden behind thick clouds, and the moon was just a pale smear of light behind the overcast sky. I could barely see 3 meters ahead of me. I started walking. The path was rough, more rock than dirt, and I stumbled often in the darkness. The weight of the sack dug into my shoulder, and with every step I could feel the poison inside shifting, settling, waiting to be used. I tried not to think about what I was going to do. I tried not to think about anything at all. But the silence would not let me escape my thoughts. It was not natural silence. On a normal night in the mountains there would be sounds. Owls calling, rodents scurrying, insects singing their eternal songs. Tonight there was nothing. Not a single living creature made a noise. It was as if the entire mountain had been holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I walked for what felt like hours, though it could not have been more than 40 minutes. And then finally I crested a ridge and looked down into the valley of Don Jacinto's ranch. It was exactly as I remembered it. The impossibly green grass, the sleeping cattle, the absolute stillness that hung over everything like a funeral shroud. But tonight there was something else, something I had not seen before. A light. It flickered in the distance near what I assumed was the main farmhouse. A single point of orange in the sea of black, steady and unwavering. Someone was awake. I should turn back, I thought. If they see me, if they catch me, everything is over. But even as the thought formed, I knew I would not turn back. Something was pulling me forward, drawing me down into that valley like a fish on a hook. I did not know if it was my own stubbornness or something else, something external, something that wanted me to come closer. I descended into the valley. The grass was wet with dew soaking through my boots and the cuffs of my pants within seconds. The cold was even more intense here, a deep, bone-aching chill that seemed to radiate up from the ground itself. I moved slowly, carefully, trying to make as little noise as possible. The cattle were arranged differently tonight. Instead of being scattered across the pasture, they were clustered together in the center, arranged in concentric circles around a bare patch of earth. Their eyes were open, gleaming faintly in the darkness, but they did not move, did not blink, did not seem to breathe. They were not sleeping. They were waiting. I stopped at the edge of the herd, my hand frozen on the drawstring of the burlap sack. Something was very wrong here. Something beyond the strangeness I had encountered on my first visit. Then I smelled it. Burning. Decay. Something chemical that stung my nostrils and made my eyes water. The same smell that had invaded my shack that night, that had filled my lungs when the entity pressed its hand against my chest. But stronger now, so overwhelming that my stomach heaved, and I had to swallow hard to keep from vomiting. I should run, I thought. I should drop this sack and run and never stop running, but my legs would not obey. They were rooted to the spot as if the grass had grown up around my ankles and trapped me in place. And then a voice spoke. You came back. It came from everywhere and nowhere, rumbling through the ground beneath my feet, echoing off the hills that surrounded the valley. It was the voice from my shack, the voice of grinding stones and ancient malice, but louder now, more present, more real. I did not think you would be so foolish. I tried to speak, but my throat had closed up. All I could manage was a strangled whimper. Your compadre sent you, the voice continued. He filled your bag with poison and pointed you toward my land and told you to destroy what is mine. Again. The smell grew stronger. The air grew colder. And somewhere in the darkness ahead of me, something began to move. I gave you a warning, the voice said, and now there was something almost like disappointment in it. I told you what would happen if you returned. I told you the price of disobedience. A figure emerged from the shadows between the motionless cattle. It was taller than I remembered. Nearly 3 meters, its body impossibly thin, wrapped in darkness that clung to it like smoke. The wide-brimmed hat sat low on its head, concealing its upper face in absolute shadow. But I could see the lower half now illuminated by some sourceless light, and what I saw made every muscle in my body seize with terror. The face was not human. It might have been once long ago, but whatever it was now had left humanity far behind. The skin was like charcoal, cracked and fissured, with something glowing faintly beneath, as if fire still burned in its veins. The jaw was too long, too narrow, hinged in a way that suggested it could open far wider than any human mouth. And when it opened that mouth to speak, I saw rows of teeth that gleamed like volcanic glass, sharp and black and endless. "Do you know what I am?" the thing asked, taking another step toward me. I shook my head, still unable to form words. "I am the guardian of this land. I have been here since before your people crossed the ocean, since before the ones who came before them built their temples of stone. I am older than your God, older than your devil, older than the names you give to things you do not understand." It was close enough now that I could feel the heat radiating off its body, a feverish warmth that cut through the cold like a blade. Men have called me many things over the centuries: the Watcher, the Gatekeeper, the Collector of Debts. Your people call me El Hombre Negro, the man in black. But names are just sounds. What matters is what I do. "And what do you do?" I managed to croak out. The mouth opened wider, revealing more of those black glass teeth, and what emerged was something that might have been a smile on a creature that had never learned how humans were supposed to smile. "I protect what is mine. I punish those who trespass, and I collect what is owed." The creature reached out one hand, and I saw for the first time what its fingers looked like. Long, impossibly long, with too many joints ending in nails that curved like talons. They were black as obsidian and sharp as broken glass, and they reached toward my face with deliberate slowness. "Your compadre is the poisoner," it said. "He is the one who conceived this evil. He will pay the highest price. But you are his instrument, his hands, his weapon, and weapons must be broken before they can be used again." The clawed fingers touched my cheek, and pain exploded through my skull. It was like being branded, like having molten metal pressed against my face, but the sensation radiated inward, burning through my thoughts, my memories, my sense of self. I screamed or tried to scream, but no sound came out. The touch lasted only a second. Then the creature withdrew its hand and stepped back. I fell to my knees, gasping, tears streaming down my face. My cheek throbbed with a pain that went beyond physical sensation. It felt like something had been taken from me, some piece of my soul that I would never get back. "That is a reminder," the creature said, "a small taste of what awaits those who cross me. Remember it well." I looked up at the thing through blurred vision, my body shaking uncontrollably. "But I am not without mercy," it continued. "You are not the true villain here. You are a tool, nothing more. A desperate man doing desperate things to feed his family. I have seen millions like you over the centuries." It leaned down, bringing its ruined face close to mine. The smell was overpowering, a miasma of death and decay, and something else, something that smelled like the end of all things. "So I give you one final chance. Leave this place. Leave your compadre. Never return to my land. Never harm what is mine, and I will let you live out your natural days in peace." I nodded frantically, willing to agree to anything just to make the pain stop. But know this, Ramiro. The use of my name sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I had never told it my name. I had never told anyone here my name. The debt does not disappear. It is merely postponed. You have been marked. Your bloodline has been marked. And one day, when you least expect it, I will come to collect what is owed. The creature straightened up, towering over me like a monument to everything dark and terrible in the world. "It may not be you. It may be your children. Or their children, or theirs. But the debt will be paid. This I promise you." It turned and began to walk away, its movements eerily smooth, as if it was gliding rather than stepping. "Now go," it said, without looking back, and do not make me remind you again." I scrambled to my feet, my legs barely supporting my weight. The burlap sack lay on the ground where I had dropped it, the poisoned corn spilling out onto the wet grass. I left it there. I did not care about the poison anymore. I did not care about Ernesto or his revenge or his failing business. All I cared about was getting away. I ran, not walked, not jogged, ran as fast as my exhausted body could carry me through the herd of motionless cattle up the slope of the valley toward the ridge where I had descended what felt like a lifetime ago. My lungs burned, my legs screamed. The wound on my cheek throbbed with every heartbeat. Behind me I heard something following. Not the creature. Something else. Something with hooves. I risked a glance over my shoulder and immediately wished I had not. The black bull was chasing me. It was enormous, far larger than any bull I had ever seen, with horns that curved like harvesting scythes and a body that seemed to absorb the faint moonlight rather than reflect it. Its eyes glowed that terrible ember red, and steam poured from its nostrils with every thundering breath. It was not running at full speed. It was pacing itself, staying just behind me, close enough that I could hear the pounding of its hooves, but never quite catching up. It was herding me, playing with me, enjoying my fear. I ran harder, my vision narrowing to a tunnel, my entire world reduced to the next step, the next breath, the next desperate lunge forward. Branches whipped my face. Rocks turned under my feet. I fell hard, slamming into the ground with enough force to knock the wind out of me, and as I fell, I felt something rake across my back. 3 lines of fire from my shoulder blade to my lower spine. I screamed, the sound torn from my throat before I could stop it. The pain was immense, blinding, worse than the touch on my cheek had been. I rolled onto my side and looked up. The bull stood over me. Its massive head lowered those coal-fire eyes, studying me with something that might have been satisfaction. Then it snorted a sound like a blacksmith's bellows and stepped back. I did not wait to see what it would do next. I forced myself to my feet, ignoring the agony in my back, and kept running. I ran until my legs gave out completely and I collapsed at the edge of the road where I had left my truck. The truck that was now running perfectly. The engine idled quietly in the darkness, as if it had never stopped working. The headlights cast twin cones of light across the dirt road. The door was open, waiting for me, an invitation, or a dismissal. I crawled into the cab, slammed the door shut, and threw the truck into gear. The tires spun on the loose gravel, then caught. And I was moving, accelerating down the mountain road faster than was safe, not caring about the curves or the cliffs or the possibility of crashing. I looked in the rearview mirror only once. The bull stood in the middle of the road, watching me go. And next to it, tall and dark and patient, was the man in black. They did not follow. They did not need to. They knew I would never come back. The silence that fell over me as I drove was the heaviest thing I had ever experienced. No engine sounds, even though the truck was running. No wind through the cracked windows. No thoughts in my head, no emotions in my heart. Just a vast, empty quiet that pressed against my eardrums like water pressure at the bottom of the ocean. I drove for hours without seeing a single other vehicle, without passing a single house or village. The road unwound before me like a gray ribbon in the darkness, endless and featureless. And I followed it mindlessly, my hands moving the wheel on autopilot, while my consciousness floated somewhere far away. When I finally pulled into Ernesto's ranch, the sun was beginning to rise. Orange and pink light crept over the hills, painting the world in colors I had almost forgotten existed. Birds were singing, cattle were lowing in the pastures. It was beautiful. It was wrong. I sat in the truck for a long time, staring at the familiar buildings without really seeing them. My back burned where the claws had raked me. My cheek throbbed where the creature had touched it. My entire body felt like it belonged to someone else, a puppet that I was operating from a great distance. When I finally went inside, Ernesto was waiting for me. He took one look at my face and knew something had gone wrong. His expression shifted from expectation to confusion to rage in the space of a heartbeat. "What happened?" he demanded. I did not answer. I could not find the words. "Did you scatter the poison? Did you do what I asked?" I shook my head slowly. Ernesto's face went red. His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You failed me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Again. I gave you one simple task, and you failed me." I tried to explain. I tried to tell him about the creature, about the warning, about the marks that even now burned on my skin. But the words came out jumbled, fragmented, making no sense even to my own ears. Ernesto did not believe me. He did not want to believe me. He called me a coward, a liar, a superstitious fool who had let old wives' tales scare him away from doing his duty. "Get out," he said, finally, after he had exhausted his insults. "Get off my property. I never want to see you again." I looked at him, this man who had been my friend, my compadre, the godfather of my child. I barely recognized him. His eyes were sunken and wild. His face was haggard and gray. He had lost weight, lost color, lost everything that had once made him seem strong and reliable. The darkness had touched him too, but unlike me, he did not have the sense to be afraid. "Compadre," I said, "one last attempt. Please. Something terrible is coming. You have to leave this place. Take Magdalena and the children and go somewhere far away, somewhere it cannot find you." He laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "You are insane," he said. "Get out before I throw you out." I left. There was nothing else I could do. I gathered my few possessions from the shack, stuffed them into my bag, and began the long walk toward the main road. Behind me I could hear Ernesto shouting, ranting, cursing my name. I did not look back. At the crest of the hill overlooking the ranch, I stopped and turned for one last look at the place that had been my home for nearly a year. The morning sun was fully up now, bathing everything in golden light. The cattle grazed peacefully in the pastures. The farmhouse sat solid and strong against the backdrop of green hills. But there was something else, something on the roof of the barn that had not been there before. A crow. Just one, black as midnight, sitting on the peak of the roof and staring directly at me. And in the tree line behind the property, almost invisible in the shadows, I could just make out a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat, watching, waiting. I turned and walked away. The weeks that followed were the strangest of my life. I returned to the village and tried to resume my old existence. I found work at a construction site in the nearest town, carrying bricks and mixing cement for wages that were a fraction of what Ernesto had paid me. Lucia was happy to have me home, even if she did not understand why I'd left the ranch so suddenly. Miguel, now old enough to crawl, followed me around the house with adoring eyes that made my heart ache with guilt. Every night I dreamed of the man in black. Sometimes he was chasing me through endless corridors of darkness. Sometimes he was standing at the foot of my bed, watching me sleep. Sometimes he spoke to me, his grinding stone voice, reciting my sins, reminding me of my debt, promising that payment would come. I started sleeping with a light on. It did not help. The wounds on my back healed slowly, leaving 3 parallel scars that stood out white against my brown skin. They ached when the weather changed, when I overexerted myself, when I thought too hard about that night in the mountains. The mark on my cheek faded until it was nearly invisible, but I could still feel it, a cold spot that never quite warmed, no matter how hot the day. And then the news came. It arrived through whispers, at first rumors carried by travelers and vendors who passed through our village. Something had happened at Ernesto's ranch. Something terrible. The first story I heard said that all his cattle had died in a single night, found stiff and cold in the pastures without any sign of disease or injury. The second story said that the land itself had turned against him, the grass withering, the wells running dry, the crops rotting in the fields. The third story said that Ernesto had gone mad, that he wandered his ruined property day and night, talking to shadows, screaming at things that no one else could see. I tried to tell myself that it was not my concern anymore, that I had warned him, that I had done everything I could, but guilt is a patient poison. 6 weeks after I left the ranch, I received word that Ernesto's youngest son had died, Tonito, 4 years old. The same little boy who used to follow me around the barn asking endless questions about the cows and the stars and why the sky was blue. He had drowned in the creek near the property. The circumstances, according to those who told the story, were strange. Tonito had been sick for days, too weak to walk, let alone wander outside. Yet somehow, in the middle of the night, he had left the house and made his way to the water. Alone, without anyone hearing him go. They found him face down in the shallows in water so shallow that a child should have been able to simply stand up. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. His mouth was frozen in a silent scream. And on the bank of the creek they found footprints, large footprints, too large for any man, pressed so deep into the mud that they might have been made by something weighing 1,000 pounds. Footprints with no toes. When I heard this, I went outside and vomited until there was nothing left in my stomach. Then I sat on the ground behind my house and wept. I wept for Tonito, that innocent child who had done nothing wrong. I wept for Magdalena, who had already suffered so much. I wept for Ernesto, who had brought this doom upon his family through his greed and his hatred. And I wept for myself, for the part I had played, for the darkness I had invited into my life and the lives of everyone I loved. The debt will be paid, the man in black had said, and now it was being paid in blood and tears and broken lives. But I had been warned. I had been given a choice, and I had chosen to walk away. Ernesto had not. I attended the funeral from a distance, watching from the hill above the cemetery as they lowered the tiny coffin into the ground. Ernesto stood at the graveside, his body shrunken, his face aged decades in the weeks since I had last seen him. Magdalena clung to his arm, but he did not seem to notice her. He stared at the hole in the earth with empty eyes, seeing something that no one else could see. I wanted to go down there to offer comfort, to tell him I was sorry. But as I started to descend the hill, I saw something that stopped me cold. A crow sat on a tombstone near the grave. Just one black as midnight, watching the mourners with bright knowing eyes. And at the edge of the cemetery, half hidden behind an old oak tree, stood a tall figure in a wide-brimmed hat, watching, always watching. I turned and walked away, and I did not look back. 2 days after the funeral, Ernesto and his family disappeared. One morning they were there, rattling around their ruined ranch, trying to salvage what little remained. The next morning they were gone. The house stood empty, the doors unlocked, their possessions still inside. It was as if they had simply vanished in the middle of the night. Some said they had fled north toward the border, running from debts and creditors and the ghosts of their failures. Some said they had gone south to Magdalena's family in Oaxaca, seeking refuge among relatives who might take them in. Some said they had never left at all. That if you went to the ranch at midnight, you could still see lights in the windows, could still hear screaming from inside the house, could still see a small figure wandering near the creek, calling out for his mother. I did not know what to believe. I did not want to know. I tried to forget. I threw myself into work, into family, into the simple rhythms of daily life. I watched Miguel take his first steps, speak his first words, grow from infant to toddler to small boy. I held Lucia in the darkness of our bedroom and told her that everything would be all right, that the past was behind us, that we had nothing to fear. I almost believed it, but the scars on my back never faded. And sometimes late at night I would wake to the sound of bells. Ting, 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 faint and far away, but always there, always waiting. It was nearly 2 months after Ernesto's disappearance that I finally sought help. My uncle Eugenio lived on the outskirts of the village in a small adobe house surrounded by herbs and strange symbols painted on the walls. He was a curandero, a healer who worked with plants and prayers and things that the church did not approve of. My family had always been slightly embarrassed by him, this odd old man, who claimed to see spirits and speak to the dead. But I had seen spirits now. I had spoken to something far worse than the dead. I went to him on a gray afternoon when clouds hung low over the hills and the air smelled of coming rain. He was sitting on his porch, smoking a hand-rolled cigarette, watching me approach with eyes that saw more than they should. "I was wondering when you would come," he said, before I could speak. "Sit down, nephew. Tell me what happened." I sat, and I told him everything. The job with Ernesto, the poisoned corn, the trips to rival ranches, the night I first entered Don Jacinto's land. The bells, the breathing, the thing in the darkness, the warning, the mark, the final confrontation, the scars on my back, the death of Tonito. Through it all, my uncle listened without interrupting, his face grave. When I finished, he was silent for a long time, staring at the mountains in the distance. "You have been touched by El Guardian," he said finally. "The keeper. One of the old ones, the spirits that lived in this land before our ancestors ever arrived." He turned to look at me, and there was something like fear in his eyes. "You are lucky to be alive, nephew. Most who meet El Guardian do not survive the encounter. That he let you go, that he gave you a chance to walk away, this is unusual. He must have seen something in you, some spark of goodness that could still be saved." "He saw that I was a tool," I said bitterly. "A weapon, not worth destroying on my own." "Perhaps." Or perhaps he saw a man who was desperate to feed his family, a man who had been led astray by someone he trusted. The old ones are not mindless forces of destruction. They understand desperation. They understand love. They understand the things that drive men to do terrible things. He took a long drag on his cigarette. "But you are right about one thing. You have been marked. Your bloodline has been marked. The debt that Ernesto incurred, the debt that you helped create, it does not simply disappear because one man runs away or another dies. What can I do?" I asked, my voice cracking with desperation. "How can I protect my family?" My uncle stood and gestured for me to follow him inside. The interior of his house was dim and cluttered, filled with dried herbs and strange bones and candles of every color. He led me to a back room where a small altar stood against the wall, covered in offerings and images of saints mixed with symbols I did not recognize. "I can perform a limpia," he said, "a spiritual cleansing. It will not erase what has been done. It will not break the mark that El Guardian has placed on you, but it will quiet the connection. It will make you less visible to his eyes. Will it protect my son Miguel?" My uncle's face grew somber. "It will help, but I cannot promise you protection. The old ones do not forget, and they do not forgive. All I can do is buy you time. Perhaps enough time for you to live out your natural life in peace. Perhaps enough time for your son to grow old without being touched. And after that," my uncle looked at me with ancient, knowing eyes, "after that, the debt will still exist. And one day, across the generations, someone will have to pay it." He performed the limpia that night, burning copal and herbs over my body, chanting in a language I did not understand, calling on powers that existed outside the realm of churches and prayers. The smoke filled my lungs, my eyes, my mind, until I felt like I was floating outside my own body, watching from a great distance. At one point, I thought I saw the man in black standing in the corner of the room, watching the proceedings with those ember eyes. But when I blinked, he was gone. When it was over, I felt different, lighter, as if some weight I had not known I was carrying had been lifted from my shoulders. But the scars on my back still ached, and the cold spot on my cheek was still there. Some marks, I realized, can never be fully erased. I thanked my uncle and walked home through the darkness, feeling the mountain air fill my lungs with each breath. For the first time in months, I did not hear the bells. For the first time in months, I slept without dreaming of glowing eyes and grinding stone voices. I began to hope that maybe, just maybe, I had escaped. I was wrong. 23 years passed. 23 years of ordinary life, of work and family and small joys and small sorrows. I built a house for Lucia with my own hands. I watched Miguel grow from a child into a young man, saw him graduate from school, saw him leave for university in the city. I had 2 more children, both daughters, and watched them grow and marry and have children of their own. I became a grandfather. The scars on my back faded to thin white lines that only showed when I was sunburned. The cold spot on my cheek became something I barely noticed, a minor discomfort that I had learned to live with. The memories of that terrible year dimmed, becoming more like a nightmare I had once had than something that had actually happened to me. I still heard the bells sometimes late at night when the wind blew from the mountains, but they were distant now, barely audible, easy to dismiss as tricks of the aging mind. I began to believe that my uncle's limpia had worked, that El Guardian had forgotten about me, that the debt had been postponed so long that it might never come due. I was a fool. Last night, for the first time in 23 years, I heard the bells clearly. Ting, ting, ting. Not in my head, not in my dreams. In the real world, coming from the backyard of my house where my son Miguel was visiting for the weekend. I sat up in bed, my heart suddenly pounding. Lucia slept peacefully beside me, undisturbed. But I heard them. I knew I heard them. I went to the window and looked out into the night, and I saw my son standing in the middle of the yard, bathed in moonlight, staring at the distant mountains. He was not moving, not blinking, just standing there like a statue, like the cattle had stood in Don Jacinto's valley all those years ago. Waiting. I ran outside. The grass was wet with dew cold against my bare feet. The night air smelled of earth and flowers and something else, something that made my blood run cold. Something burning, something old, something that should not exist in this world. "Miguel," I called. "Miguel, what are you doing out here?" He did not respond, did not turn, did not acknowledge my presence at all. I reached him and grabbed his shoulders, spinning him around to face me. What I saw nearly stopped my heart. His eyes, my son's warm brown eyes that I had watched grow from infancy to manhood, were wrong. There was something in them that should not have been there. A glint of red like embers, like coals, like the eyes of the bull that had chased me through the mountains over 2 decades ago. He looked at me with those not quite his eyes, and his mouth curved into an expression that did not belong on his face. "Hello, Father," he said, and his voice was not his voice. It was layered, doubled, as if someone else was speaking through him, someone with a voice like grinding stones, the man in black's voice. He said to tell you that the waiting is over, that the debt has come due, that it is time to collect what is owed. "No," I whispered. "No, please not him. Take me. I am the one who trespassed. I am the one who carried the poison. Take me instead." My son's head tilted at an unnatural angle like a puppet whose strings had been twisted. "That is not how it works," the voice said through his mouth. "You were warned. You were given a choice. You chose your path. And now the consequences fall upon your bloodline, as they always do, as they always have." He raised one hand and pointed toward the mountains. I followed his finger and saw on the ridge overlooking our property 2 shapes silhouetted against the night sky. One was tall and thin with a wide-brimmed hat. The other was massive and four-legged with horns that curved against the stars. They were watching. They were waiting. And my son was walking toward them. "No!" I screamed, grabbing at his arm. "You cannot have him. I will not let you." But my hands passed through him as if he were made of smoke. He kept walking step by step toward the shapes on the ridge. I tried to follow, but my legs would not obey. I was rooted to the spot, frozen, just as I had been frozen in the valley all those years ago. "Miguel," I called out, my voice breaking. "Miguel, please, fight it. Whatever it is, telling you, whatever it is, promising you, do not listen. Come back to me, please." For a moment, just a moment, my son stopped. He turned his head, and in the moonlight I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Fear, confusion, recognition. "Father," he said. And this time it was his voice, his real voice, lost and scared. "Father, what is happening to me? Fight it," I urged him. "Remember who you are. Remember your mother, your sisters, your nieces. Remember everyone who loves you. Do not let it take you." The red glow in his eyes flickered, faded. For one beautiful, terrible moment, I thought he had broken free. And then the man in black raised one hand on the ridge above us, and I felt something tear inside me, not physically, deeper than that. In my soul, in the place where the mark had been placed 23 years ago, something ripped loose. The cold spot on my cheek blazed with sudden, searing heat. The scars on my back felt like they were opening again, fresh and raw. I understood in that moment what was happening. The debt was being called, and I had a choice. Let my son pay it, or pay it myself. It was not a choice at all. Take me, I said, and this time my voice was steady. Take what you are owed from me, not from my son, not from my blood, from me. I am the one who walked on your land. I am the one who carried the poison. The debt is mine. The man in black went still on the ridge. Even the bull stopped moving. For a long moment nothing happened. The world seemed to hold its breath. Then the voice spoke not through Miguel this time, but directly into my mind. You would give yourself willingly. Yes, I said, to save my son. Yes. Another pause. And then, incredibly, something that might have been approval. Interesting, the voice said. In all my centuries, few have made such an offer. Fewer still have meant it. The tall figure began to descend from the ridge, moving toward me with that terrible gliding walk. The bull followed its hooves, making no sound on the grass. I stood my ground. For the first time since I had encountered this thing, I did not run. I did not look away. I watched it come and I waited. It stopped 3 meters away, close enough that I could see every crack in its charred skin, every glint of those obsidian teeth, every flicker of the fire that burned behind its eyes. The debt is this, it said. 23 years of your life. The years you have lived since you trespassed on my land. They belong to me now. I felt something shift inside me, a heaviness settling into my bones, an ache spreading through my joints. When I looked down at my hands, the skin seemed loose or spotted with age. It was taking my years, literally taking them, draining them out of me like water from a cup. The pain was immense, a full-body agony that made the claw marks on my back feel like paper cuts. But I did not cry out. I did not beg. I stood there and I let it happen because that was the price, and I had agreed to pay it. When it was over, I collapsed to my knees, gasping. The man in black stood over me, and for once there was no mockery in his posture, only something that might have been respect. The debt is paid, it said. Your bloodline is free. I will not come for your children or their children or any who carry your name. It turned and began to walk away, the bull falling into step beside it. But know this, Ramiro, it said, without looking back. You have bought your family's freedom with your own years. Use what time you have left wisely. It dissolved into the darkness, and the bull with it, leaving only the smell of smoke and the fading sound of bells. I knelt there in the wet grass, my body aching. My hair turned gray in the space of minutes, my skin weathered and lined with age that had not been there before. But my son was standing beside me, his eyes brown again, his face confused, but alive, still alive. Father, he said, reaching down to help me up. What happened? I feel like I was dreaming. I looked at him, at this young man who had his whole life ahead of him, who would never know how close he had come to losing it. Nothing I said, just a bad dream. We both had a bad dream. I let him help me inside, moving slowly, feeling every one of the years that had been taken from me. But when I looked back over my shoulder, the ridge was empty, and for the first time in 23 years, I heard no bells. I am telling you this story because you need to know. Not because I want sympathy. Not because I'm looking for forgiveness, but because what happened to me could happen to anyone. Because the old ones are still out there in the wild places, in the mountains and forests and forgotten corners of the world. Because they are patient and they are powerful and they never forget a debt. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. Do not trespass where you do not belong. Do not harm what is not yours. Do not let desperation or greed or loyalty to the wrong people lead you down paths that you cannot return from. Because there are things in this world that are older than churches and stronger than prayers. Things that watch and wait and remember. Things that will come for you or for your children or for their children when you least expect it. And when they come, there is always a price. This morning I looked at myself in the mirror. The face that looked back was an old man's face, lined and weathered with white hair and tired eyes. I lost 23 years in a single night. The doctors cannot explain it. They call it a medical mystery, an anomaly, something that should not be possible. I know what it was. I know the price I paid, and I would pay it again because my son is safe. My daughters are safe. My grandchildren will grow up never knowing the shadow that once hung over our family. The debt is paid, but sometimes late at night, when the wind blows from the mountains, I still hear something. Not bells, not anymore. Something else, something that might be a voice, or might be the wind, or might be my imagination. It says, remember. And I do, every day, every night. For whatever time I have left, I remember. If you are listening to this, I have only one piece of advice. Do not go into the mountains after dark. Do not make deals with desperate men. And if you ever hear bells ringing where there should be no bells, if you ever smell something burning on a windless night, if you ever feel eyes watching you from the shadows, do not investigate. Do not be curious. Do not be brave. Walk away, and do not look back. Because once they mark you, once they know your name, once they add your bloodline to their ledger of debts, you will spend the rest of your life waiting for them to collect, and they always collect. This is a true story. It happened to me, and every word of it is real. Sleep well tonight, and whatever you do, do not answer when the bells ring.